Food companies have a secret threshold, a specific percentage by which they can shrink your food, and as long as they stay below it, your brain will never detect the change. This threshold comes from a 19th century experiment on human perception. It has been in psychology textbooks for 150 years. The food industry has been using it against you for decades. In 2016, one company accidentally crossed it. The global backlash that followed exposed what had been happening in silence for years. Let's start with something that happened almost 200 years before the Toblerone scandal. In the 1830s, a German physiologist named Ernst Heinrich Weber was trying to understand something that had puzzled scientists for years. How much does something need to change before you notice the difference? He ran experiments. He gave people weights to hold and asked them to tell him when one felt heavier than another. He showed them lines and asked them to identify which was longer. What he discovered was a fundamental law of human perception that still governs the science of consumer behavior today. The amount something needs to change for you to notice is not a fixed number, it is a fixed percentage of the original. If you are holding a 100-gram weight, you need to add about 2 grams before you feel the difference. If you are holding a 1,000-gram weight, you need to add about 20 grams. The threshold scales with the starting point. Scientists called this the just noticeable difference, or JND. Now here's where it gets interesting for the food industry, because the JND does not just apply to weights and lengths, it applies to everything we perceive, including the size of a product, how full a bag feels, and how long a chocolate bar looks in your hand. The food industry did not just discover this principle. They built entire departments around it. Companies employ teams of pricing strategists, psychologists, and packaging engineers, whose entire job is to reduce product size in increments small enough to stay below the JND threshold, the level at which your brain registers that something has changed. This is engineering. Take the Charmin toilet roll. In the 1980s, the original Charmin roll had 650 sheets. Today, you can buy a Charmin Mega Roll, a Double Mega Roll, a Super Mega Roll, all names that imply more. And every single one of them has fewer sheets than the original plain roll did in 1980. The naming innovation exists specifically to obscure the size reduction, and it works because each individual step was kept below the threshold your brain uses to detect change. That is not coincidence. That is engineering. Here is the specific mechanism. When a company wants to reduce the size of a product, the pricing team looks at 2 numbers. First, the current size. Second, the JND percentage for that product category, which for packaged food is typically between 5% and 10%. Any reduction below that threshold, and most consumers will not notice the change. Any reduction above that threshold, and people start posting angry tweets about gaps in their chocolate bars. Toblerone's mistake in 2016 was not reducing the size, it was reducing it, making the change visible. The gap between the peaks was impossible to miss. They crossed the JND threshold and paid the price in public outrage. But here's the darker version of that story that nobody talks about. Mondelez, Toblerone's parent company, had already been reducing the size of Toblerone bars for years before the Gap incident. In 2010, the 200-gram bar became 170 grams, quietly. Below the JND, nobody noticed. No viral tweets, no international news coverage, just a slightly lighter bar that most people assumed had always been that weight. The Gap incident wasn't Mondelez getting greedy, it was Mondelez getting sloppy. They stayed inside the JND for 15 years, and then, under pressure from the discount retailer Poundland, which refused to accept a price increase, they made a change too large to hide. And when it blew up, when the whole world suddenly learned what shrinkflation was and started looking at their favorite products with new suspicion, Mondelez did something that reveals exactly how this system works. They reversed the change. They brought back the original shape. And then they released a new 200-gram bar at a price more than double what the 170-gram bar had cost. The consumers who celebrated the restoration of the original Toblerone were paying twice as much for it as they had before the controversy started. That is not an accident. That is a strategy. The term shrinkflation was coined by economist Pippa Malmgren around 2009, but the practice itself goes back centuries. Medieval bakers in Europe regularly sold smaller loaves when grain prices rose, rather than charging more for the same size. Regulators who caught them doing it sometimes punished them by ducking them in water. In Vienna, as recently as 1773, bakers were subjected to what historians called baker dunking for selling underweight bread. The logic was the same then as it is now. People are more sensitive to price changes than to quantity changes. Tell someone their loaf costs more and they will argue with you, switch bakers, or write a letter of complaint. Give them a slightly smaller loaf at the same price, and they will probably never notice. And if they do notice, they will blame their own memory rather than assume the baker deliberately cheated them. This psychological asymmetry, the fact that we are far more attuned to price changes than to quantity changes, is the entire foundation of shrinkflation. Modern food companies have turned that insight into a deliberate, data-driven practice. Between 2012 and 2019, the average size of packaged food in American grocery stores declined by 14.6%. In the UK, between 2012 and 2017, over 2,500 products shrank in size. Digestive biscuits lost 28% of their weight over a decade. Crisp packets shrank by 17%, butter packs by 20%, and breakfast cereals by more than 10%. In almost none of these cases was the consumer told. There is no legal requirement in most countries to inform buyers when a product has been downsized. The weight is printed on the label in small text as required by law, but the old weight is not shown alongside it. There is no now 15% smaller sticker, no announcement, no apology. The package looks the same, the shelf space looks the same, the price looks the same. And the brain, without a direct comparison, has no reliable way to detect that anything has changed, and the change goes unnoticed, which is exactly how the companies want it. Now let's be fair about one thing, because the story is slightly more complicated than corporations are stealing from you. Some shrinkflation genuinely does happen because production costs increase. Ingredient prices, energy costs, transport, labor, all of these have risen significantly over the past decade. And companies face a real dilemma: raise the price and lose customers to a competitor who has not raised their price yet. Shrink the product and most customers will not notice. This is a real business choice for many firms. From a pure business logic standpoint, shrinkflation is rational. Consumers consistently report that they prefer smaller packages at the same price over the same size package at a higher price, even when the per unit cost is identical. The psychology is clear. A higher price number feels like a loss. A smaller package barely registers, but here the story turns darker. Because the rational business justification for shrinkflation assumes it happens when costs rise and reverses when costs fall. And that is not what happened during and after the COVID-19 pandemic. Between 2020 and 2022, food companies faced genuine cost pressures, supply chain disruptions, ingredient shortages, energy spikes. Shrinkflation accelerated, products shrank, prices stayed the same or rose. Then costs began to moderate, supply chains normalized, ingredient prices fell back toward pre-pandemic levels, energy costs stabilized, and the products stayed small, the prices stayed high. The margins that food companies had built during the crisis period by both raising prices and reducing quantities simultaneously became the new normal. In 2024, a University of Massachusetts study found that between 2012 and 2019, the average size of packaged food declined by 14.6%, contributing nearly 4 percentage points to measured food inflation that was otherwise invisible. That is 4 percentage points of price increases that did not show up in any official inflation numbers because they were hidden inside the packaging. This is why so many households feel worse off than economic indicators suggest they should. The official inflation rate might fall. The cost of your grocery basket does not fall with it, because the products in your basket have been quietly, methodically, scientifically reduced in size over years. And that reduction does not reverse just because the economic pressure that originally justified it has eased. This shrinking has happened quietly. The profits do not go back to the consumer. They stay with the company. And there's a third form of this that's even harder to detect than size reduction. Researchers and economists call it skimpflation, when companies keep the package size and the price the same, but reduce the quality of the ingredients inside. The mayonnaise that used to contain 9% egg yolk now contains 6% egg and 1.5% egg yolk. The chocolate bar that used to use cocoa butter now uses vegetable fat as a partial substitute. The orange juice that used to be fresh squeezed is now made from concentrate, but sold in the same carton design. The bread that used to be made with 4 ingredients now has 14. The frozen pizza that looks identical to the one from 5 years ago uses cheaper cheese and more water in the sauce. None of this is illegal. All of it is on the label, technically, if you read it carefully enough, and almost nobody does. There is one country that decided enough was enough. In 2023, the French supermarket chain Carrefour began placing bright yellow labels on products that had undergone shrinkflation, identifying the brand, showing the old size, the new size, and the effective price increase per unit. The labels were uncomfortable for manufacturers. Several threatened legal action. Consumer awareness in those stores increased immediately. France then passed a law in 2024 requiring all retailers to clearly disclose shrinkflation to consumers. The food industry lobbied against it. They lost. In the United States, senators introduced the Shrinkflation Prevention Act. President Biden mentioned it in his 2024 State of the Union address. The bill has not passed. There are no labeling requirements. There is no mandatory disclosure. Companies can continue reducing the size of products indefinitely without telling the people buying them, and they will, because the science is clear on this. Research published in the journal Marketing Science found that consumers are more than 5 times more likely to find products that have been downsized than upsized in grocery stores. And crucially, consumers' reaction to a size reduction is close to 0, while their reaction to a price increase is significant and measurable. Companies are not shrinking products because they have no choice. They are shrinking products because they have run the data, and the data tells them it works. So what can you actually do about it? The most effective tool available to a consumer is unit pricing, comparing the price per 100 grams or per ounce rather than the package price. Every major supermarket is required to display unit pricing alongside the shelf price. Most people never look at it. When you compare unit prices across products and across time, shrinkflation becomes instantly visible. A product that used to cost 42 cents per 100 grams and now costs 51 cents per 100 grams has effectively had a 21% price increase regardless of what the label price says. The second tool is comparison shopping across brands. Shrinkflation tends to happen across an entire category simultaneously. When grain prices rise, all the cereal brands shrink together. But the timing is rarely perfectly coordinated. A competitor might hold their size for an extra quarter, making them temporarily better value on a per-unit basis. The companies know this, which is why they prefer that you shop by brand loyalty rather than by unit value. The third and most uncomfortable truth is that the most effective form of pushback is the Toblerone response: public humiliation. Companies don't change their behavior because of regulatory pressure that doesn't exist. They change their behavior when the backlash is large enough to damage the brand. The Toblerone controversy forced a reversal. The Charmin controversy forced a public response. The supermarket loyalty card scandals forced pricing reviews. The gap in the Toblerone bar wasn't just an outrage, it was a crack in the system, a moment where the mechanism became visible enough that people could point at it and name it. The food industry has spent decades building a system that is invisible by design. The science of staying below the just noticeable difference. The practice of making every reduction small enough that your brain can't detect it. The legal framework that requires disclosure of the new size, but not comparison to the old one. It works because we're busy, because we trust the brands we've bought for years, because checking the weight on a packet of biscuits before every purchase feels like an absurd amount of effort for something that should just be what it's always been. But that trust That assumption of continuity is exactly the vulnerability they're exploiting. Every product that looks the same, costs the same, but contains less than it used to is a quiet bet that you won't notice. And for most of those products, for most of those people, for most of those purchases, the bet pays off. The gap in the Toblerone was a mistake. Everything else is working exactly as planned.